Welcome to a new episode of the ECPR Political Science Matters podcast. My name is Raul Gomez. I am one of the editors of the Political Data Yearbook, and today we're discussing the UK general election, which is set to take place on the 4th of July. Without further ado, I'll introduce our two guests. Nicholas Salem, Professor of Politics at Royal Holloway University of London, and Alia Middleton, Senior Lecturer in Politics and Co-Director of the Centre for Britain and Europe at the University of Surrey. Welcome both.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
So usually I start the podcast by asking colleagues if they're excited about the general election, but I don't know if the national mood in this case is one of excitement or something else.
I think you're probably asking the wrong people here. I'm terrifically excited by the general election, and in no way have I bought a 2-meter high map to colour in on election night. I have. So yeah, I'm finding it absolutely fascinating, but I suspect the vast majority of the public are finding it less scintillating academic, yes.
I think it's certainly fascinating from an academic point of view and what's going to happen. But if I take off my academic hat for a moment, I think I've never been less enthused for a general election in my life. So I'm very much torn between these two positions. It really does feel a little bit like a sort of very deflated general election in some ways. That's kind of a lot of the air has gone out of the campaign. It just seemed really flat for all sorts of reasons. I think fairly good reasons, which themselves are very interesting, very fascinating, and will give a lot of scholars a lot of things to say over the coming months and years.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first topic I'd like to discuss is why did Rishi Sunak call a snap election now when the economy is still not doing very well, rather than wait until winter and see how things go further along the line? So do you think, in retrospect, it was the right decision to make?
Yeah, I mean, to paraphrase Dee Ream's theme from Labour's 1997 general election campaign, I think things could only get worse for the Conservatives if they decided to hang on until October, November time. I think they were desperately angling for slightly better news that might speed them slightly along if the poll were to take place in autumn. But there was higher than expected borrowing in April. That meant that they're going to be in less of a position to actually have big kind of financial giveaways ahead of a prospective autumn budget. And also there were kind of various other economic issues that, kind of inflation, okay, it's come down slightly, but not as much as they wanted or indeed expected. And also some kind of fairly expensive things looming in the horizon, such as compensation for the infected blood scandal, where in the 1970s and 80s, people were given transfusions on the NHS that were infected with hepatitis and HIV, and there's been a big public inquiry. And so a lot of big kind of expensive things that just means that, the economy is not going to be in a better position. And also, if you look at the figures in terms of boat crossings, this is a kind of a key narrative of British politics in the last kind of 2 years or so, certainly. They rise over summer. So, why would you wait over summer? The Rwanda scheme, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? I think it's probably the least worst option to have gone now.
It's fairly well established that prime ministers go to the country early when they think things are not going to get any better, or in this case, things could very well get a lot worse. I suppose until July, actually it was until June, no, May. I've lost track already. I thought, with absolutely nothing more to go on than a hunch, that he would stretch it out for as long as possible until January. And I thought that partly just to be slightly contrarian to the perceived wisdom. I also thought, frankly, given the way the polls were moving long before the campaign kicked off, the likelihood of a Conservative win in a snap election was very small. Anyway, and I suppose I basically thought, if you're Rishi Sunak, you're an ambitious man, you've done pretty well in life. You're going to want to be as high up on the prime ministerial league tables in terms of time in office as you can be. So why sacrifice 6 months? It's going to drop down quite a bit. So not even making 2 full years in office, which is a bit of a disappointment. And let's face it, if he loses, he's not coming back. His political career is over. Maybe he's quite happy to do that. And one of the jokes being kicked around, many of the satirical show this on television is he's in a hurry to get away and he wants out as quickly as possible. So I suppose the other thing is the sort of Macauberish aspect of it is something might turn up. Of course, it tells you something about how bad the Conservatives or the team around Sunak are thinking things may get if they don't even have any of that sort of something might turn up. I mean, that's what John Major did back in 1997, and that Parliament stretched out from April 92 pretty much to May 97, so just over 5 years. The other thing that I think Sunak's not very good at politics for all sorts of reasons we can come on to later on, but it did catch a lot of people on the hop. Now, that could have been a good thing. One of the reasons the early election was sort of justified by some people was that the Conservatives are very, very, very concerned about reform. This is the sort of Nigel Farage vehicle 3.0. So it's sort of UKIP begot the Brexit Party, begot reform or begat reform. And there was concern that if they allowed reform to sort of get their act together, they could really threaten the Tories on the right flank. So sort of going early, sort of cut the rug from under them. But unfortunately, whilst it cut the rug from under them, it also cut the rug to some extent from under the Conservatives' feet themselves. It wasn't the case that the party was geared up for a July election. Many activists, many MPs were thinking, we've got a few more months to get our affairs in order before the election comes, but they didn't have that chance. So there was a lot of shock, not particularly positive shock and surprise on the Conservative benches when Sunak went so early. So it's a gamble. And it's a gamble, let's face it, at time of speaking, mid-June, that looks like it's going to really blow up in Sunak's face. Whether it would have blown up even more in his face, as it were, had he stretched it out, we will never know. And that's something that I think can probably feature in one of those what might have happened books.
Let's now delve into the details of this campaign. You've already mentioned some of the issues that are being discussed. So what are the main issues in this election?
In some ways, and I really do need to emphasize that, it's a bit of a return to normal. Elections generally are about the economy and public services. I mean, they have been in Britain for most of the time that I've been following elections more or less avidly. The big exception was, of course, those recent polls that were primarily about Brexit, the Get Brexit Done election of 2019. Of course, it wasn't only about Brexit, but Brexit loomed so large it really did affect virtually, it massively affected everything else. So the economy, public services, and I suppose a bit of immigration as well. Those are sort of, I think, in descending order, the big issues, certainly from the points of view of the party. But I guess the key thing here is that whereas perhaps in a long time in the past, elections were not entirely, but sort of largely fought on a sort of single front between the two major parties, these days they're fought across many fronts between different combinations of parties amongst different kinds of voters, which makes it very, very complicated. So at some point, or in sort of one of those fronts, sort of immigration is slightly higher up the agenda than elsewhere. Labour's got to be a little bit mindful, say, of young people and the environment because of the Green parties and the Lib Dems sort of biting at their heels. So I think overall, it's clearly what affects most people's lives. The economy, study the economy, or people talk about the economy, and of course, public services, particularly the NHS, National Health Service, healthcare, but also education, the state of the schools, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there are other issues lurking around that are of sort of variable significance to different combinations of party dynamics, shall we say. So depending on whether you think about the Conservatives versus the Reform Party, or Labour sort of conscious of the SNP in Scotland, or the Green Party in other parts of the UK, it's very complicated, I guess, at some level. But big picture, it's the economy and public services stupid.
Yeah, and just to kind of I absolutely agree. If you look at polls of the British public, the most important issues to British voters, the economy and the NHS are the two issues that are kind of repeatedly tied at the top, and are indeed, as of the latest YouGov issue poll, are right at the top of the agenda, above immigration, just for British voters. Now, I'm a bit of a kind of campaign geek. I don't literally stalk the leaders where they go, but I look at where they're going during the campaign and what that kind of tells us about their party strategy. And what has been particularly notable is Sunak's and the Conservatives' actually comparative absolute lack of engagement with the NHS as a topic. At this stage of the campaign in 2019, so with kind of about 2 weeks to go before polling day, Boris Johnson had flung himself around at least 2 hospitals, maybe 3 hospitals by this point, talking to nurses, talking to patients, shirt sleeve rolled up, etc. Rishi Sunak has not been anywhere near a hospital yet. And I think that's quite remarkable, or markable, as it were. Whereas Keir Starmer was at a hospital 2 days ago. He has had a big speech on the NHS. You can't move for Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, appearing on television in an interview. So in that respect, I think Labour are actually playing a far smarter game in terms of talking about things that are mattering to the British public. Who knows? Sunak might spend the rest of this week in a hospital, performing operations. Who knows? But it just seems a very obvious gap. The narrative also, the Conservative narrative around the economy is fascinating as well. It is rather doom laden, focusing less on, we've made your life better. That's an entirely different debate outside the remit of this podcast. But they are really going on the attack when it comes to the economy. They are attacking Labour's tax plans, or not tax plans, as it were. Who knows which taxes are involved, but this figure of £2,000 that they have been hammering in interviews on social media. You better start saving because Labour's coming and there's a big floating red pig. Do look up these adverts online, they're fascinating. But that has actually slightly dropped off the agenda marginally in the last couple of days. I think they're perhaps realising that it's not necessarily cutting through. And this is a real problem with the Conservative campaign more widely. It's inherently negative, doom laden. It is depressing. Labour are going to, steal your granny type of thing. That doesn't make people enthused about elections, enthused about the campaign, want to engage with whatever party. So yeah, it's just adding to a general kind of sense of ennui, I think, in the
absolutely. I mean, I was just picking up on that point. One of the real challenges for the Conservatives is what can they campaign on? They've been in office for 14 years. The economy isn't exactly flourishing, and it isn't the case that everyone's looking to broad sunlit uplands in the future. It's going to be a struggle to campaign on the NHS, given the way that NHS waiting lists, which is one of these crucial indicators in UK politics, how long people have to wait for treatment, it's just skyrocketed in recent years. And the Conservatives can try to say, and Rishi Sunak has said, oh yes, but coming down, or maybe they're not quite as high as they were. But the point is, most people know full well that the waiting lists have gone up, and anyone who is currently having to use the NHS is fully aware just how stretched it is, how challenged it is, how long you have to wait, basically how much rationing is going on in terms of healthcare. So given that, maybe Rishi Sunak will now have to spend a week in walking around hospitals just to show that he cares, but it's sort of going through the motions if he does that, because there is really no good, plausible story about the NHS that the Tories, I think, can tell. Certainly anything that is plausible that might appeal to people who are willing to, at this point in the campaign, vote Conservative.
And just to kind of come back on that as well, he's running out of time to show that he cares about the NHS, because you do have a series of junior doctor strikes that start on the 27th of June and run, I think, through to the 2nd of July. So I don't imagine he'll want to be anywhere near a hospital at that particular point of the campaign.
Be interesting to see how Labour deal with that once the strike kicks off, because of course the Labour Party is associated with trade union movement and so on. And we know full well what the Conservative attack will be, I think, when the strikes do kick in. But I think after so long in office, after so much time for voters to observe, to take note, to experience what's going on in the public services and education and so on, I think most people's minds are fairly made up. It's not the case that the Conservatives are going to be able to convince a very large share of the undecided British electorate to vote for them. Elections are won and lost in the long haul. They're not really won or lost in campaigns, not very, very rarely, if at all. And particularly given just how far apart the two main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, been in the polls in for a very long time now. I lose track, but just given how far apart they've been, the likelihood of the parties getting closer, the Conservatives pulling hats out of rabbits and winning people over, I think is just diminishing more and more. And I think that adds to the general sense of deflation and really a lack of inspiration, frankly, in so much of it. So much of it on the Conservative side is going through the motions. So much of it on the Labour side is all about trying to almost manage expectations and demonstrate cautiousness and caution. And it's very difficult to enthuse and engage and get people excited when you have one party that's essentially discredited and the other party that's not discredited, but nonetheless isn't really doing much to inspire.
One question that I get asked a lot when I'm abroad is, what about Brexit, right? So Brexit has had huge implications for British politics and also for the Conservative Party. So why is this issue being swept under the rug? I mean, why are Labour and the Tories only talking about it in passing?
I wouldn't like to say we're in a kind of an age of post-Brexit politics in Britain, but maybe we are moving to that. But having said that, there is the kind of the Brexit fig leaf that is still an important dimension of the campaign. And by that, I mean immigration. I think immigration was always kind of an opening factor of Brexit. If we think about the Vote Leave campaign of, various kind of posters showing streams of migrants coming into the country, and, that very much being that kind of underpinning narrative. And we do see migration still being a topic under discussion in this current campaign. So Brexit is there under a Nigel Farage-esque guise, and of course he is another legacy of Brexit in swiftly renamed the Brexit Party Reform UK. It's there. I just think it's been unpacked slightly. So as I say, the economy matters. The economy, again, was part of the Brexit narrative. Migration matters. Brexit, of course, was about migration as well. So just because we're not talking about Brexit doesn't mean its long fingers are not still interfering with the campaign, I'd say.
No, it's definitely lurking there in sort of the distant horizon. But I suppose the other sort of way to think about it is to think about the different incentives that the different parties have around Brexit as a distinctive issue. So from the perspective, say, of the Conservative Party, well, they got Brexit done, in theory. That was what the 2019 general election was about. So they could talk about how brilliantly they've done Brexit. The problem is not many voters are really going to believe them, I think, on that. It isn't the case that there is enormous enthusiasm for Brexit. I mean, a lot of Conservative voters probably are still perhaps quite happy about it, but a lot of potential Conservative voters are not. So there's not really much of an incentive to talk about Brexit from the point of view of the Conservatives. From the point of view of Labour, it raises questions about the electoral coalition that Labour wants to seek to build up and how Labour tries to engage with those voters who were perhaps pro-Brexit for various reasons and might historically have voted Labour, but perhaps no longer do so, or flirted with the Conservative Party last time. But there is still a reluctance, I think, to rock the boat by bringing that up, which sort of gets to a bigger issue, which is, I think, the almost psychological trauma that Brexit inflicted on so many people for such a period of time. I don't think anyone really wants to revisit that. Certainly neither of the two major parties wants to revisit it, because such a divisive wedge issue risks splintering the parties, not just amongst voters, but even amongst MPs themselves. It's not something they really want to perhaps revisit. The parties that are sort of taking a clearer position on Brexit, I mean, the Liberal Democrats, bless them, there they are, promising to overcome that or revisit that and rejoin. Then Plaid Cymru, promising the same. The SNP are sort of pro-EU. But of course, you need to look at what they're trying to achieve, and none of them are really serious contenders for government. So in the British voting system, of course, it's essentially a two-party system. All else is embellishment and detail. And the Lib Dems are going to be there in some form in some places and so on. But they're not really gunning for full power that basically Labour's on course to get. So I think you can completely understand why the two large catch-all parties, although I'm not sure the Conservatives even count as that at the moment, given they're diving in the polls. But you can certainly see why Labour's reluctant to revisit it. It doesn't need to, for a start. Why touch upon such a emotive issue when you are so far ahead in the polls anyway, and when, frankly, most people are concerned about other issues.
Let's now move on to talk about the opinion polls. You've been mentioning these several times already. So if what all of the polls are saying at the moment, and if all of that realizes and nothing changes, this will be an unprecedented election in modern British politics, right? In more than one respect.
It's so back in 1997, the political scientist Anthony King described the New Labour margin of victory not as a landslide, but sort of an asteroid striking the Earth. That was his sort of metaphor for the scale of what happened. If the opinion polls are right, and particularly some of the predictions around the constituency level results are right, this is going to be perhaps not even an asteroid striking the Earth. It could almost be like a Big Bang kind of event. Who knows what will actually happen on the day, but it isn't the case that the polls have really closed, have narrowed, that there's suddenly fear about Labour creeping in. It's not been helped, I suppose, from the Conservative point of view, from Nigel Farage initially saying he wasn't going to stand and then suddenly saying he will stand for reform, his new electoral vehicle. And of course, that provides a key focal point for media coverage, for people to sort of might be curious about reform to attach themselves to. But if the polls are right, and I think that's still a big if, because of the way the British first past the post voting system works, it is sometimes described as Britain's second national lottery. There will be a lot of Conservative candidates and MPs who will be feeling very, very discomforted at the moment and conscious that they could well be in just double figures by the 5th of July.
Well, to paraphrase the 2010 leader debate, I agree with Nick. Yes, it is almost an extinction level event for the Conservatives if current polling stands in the next kind of 2 weeks. The question is, can Labour do anything to destroy that? I don't know. I mean, short of setting fire to the king, I'm not entirely certain. I know they're adopting kind of quite a cautious, almost what's been described as a Ming Vase strategy. Just kind of let's be quiet, let's be uncontroversial, let's say some things that are kind of quite boring and no one will kind of really take any notice, and then everything will be fine. No one will notice. We'll just suddenly become the government. I wouldn't like to be a Conservative candidate right now. I think it's incredibly difficult, and you can see the weariness actually when they are being interviewed on TV, when they appear on your doorstep as they have been lurking about, even cabinet ministers. They've got to keep this up for another couple of weeks. I also think the Conservative campaign had such a terrible start as well, with a soggy Sunak announcing the election whilst being drowned out by a loudspeaker playing D-Ream, things can only get better. And then, of course, all these kind of gaffes that he has had of appearing at the Titanic Quarter, and of course the D-Day debacle, which I shall name it as, when he left the commemorations for D-Day earlier than other leaders. And that has really just kind of, I think, killed any momentum that the Conservative campaign had. Campaigning is primarily about conversion and mobilization. And you convert or try and convert one group of voters and you mobilize your core voters. And even from the very start of the campaign, the Conservatives knew that they weren't really going to convert new voters to their cause. They've been in power 14 years. They're familiar faces. We know their policies, even if they do keep changing the top team. It's about mobilizing that core. And you have policy announcements like national service, kind of fantastic. It's really kind of tapping into that narrative, the quadruple lock on pensions. But then that D-Day instance, I think, is kind of going to be looked back as a kind of a key kind of turning point, because it's exactly that type of commemoration, exactly that type of event that really matters to your kind of core voters. And it just really undermined whatever Sunak was saying, and it dominated the airwaves for days. It's still coming up on occasion now. So yeah, I don't see the polls narrowing, and it's kind of Quinn's alternating predominance, isn't it? That you have these cycles in British politics where one party is in power for a long period of time and they get into this kind of terminal velocity that no matter what they do, people just stop engaging and stop listening. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the alternative is a scintillatingly exciting prospect, but it's an alternative. It is change. And I think that's where the Conservatives are heading. And I'll be fascinated to see what actually happens to the Conservatives post-election, whether Farage all of a sudden pops up and steals a load of Conservatives over to Reform, or whether there is a kind of a resurgence of the Conservative Party. But it's not going to be an electorally competitive force for a decade, I'd say at least. They're really in that bad a situation.
I think absolutely. I mean, it's been a dreadful campaign. The little anecdote to sort of illustrate how bad it's been, I think. So with my 5-year-old son, we were watching Rishi Sunak's speech in Downing Street when he announced that he was calling a general election. He was soaked and looked very silly and went back drenched. A few days later, I was in our back garden mowing the lawn. Started raining. I was banking on it not going to rain, but it did. And I got a little bit wet. And my 5-year-old said, "Papa, you're like Rishi Sunak." And I was like, "What? I'm the Prime Minister?" "No, you're wet." So, I mean, even a 5-year-old got that. I was quite astounded. And also on the point about the Conservatives' difficulties in trying to mobilize their voters, the constant messaging and reinforcement of the likely possible extinction level event facing the Conservatives makes it much harder to actually mobilize the voters, because what's the point? Going to lose anyway. Why should I might as well, if someone has views that are slightly more right wing than moderate, they might well think, oh, I'm going to vote Reform this time anyway, or just not bother voting. It's really difficult, I think, to even, to get any sense of enthusiasm. It's really been sucked out. And of course, looking ahead to the future, one of the great problems that sort of Ali was alluding to is just how few young people are likely to vote Conservative. Where is the Conservative future going to come from? It really has tanked amongst younger voters. So yeah, it's going to be tough for them over the next parliament or 2 or 3 or 4.
Well, how did the Conservatives end up here? I mean, I remember after the 2019 election and after the huge majority that the Conservatives got, everybody was saying it will take at least 2 elections, if not more, for Labour to actually recover. So how did they ruin all that kind of so that massive amount of votes that they had basically put together in the 2019 election in only 5 years?
Well, and the Conservative Party has eaten itself. They have kind of single-handedly, I think, undermined their vote from 2019 in many instances. Maybe a very kind of fractional part of it is the 2019 election was the Brexit election. Boris Johnson riding a digger through a wall of cardboard boxes that had gridlock on them. That kind of symbolically destroying Brexit with his power. But we are in this kind of post-Brexit scenario, and of course we've had COVID, that pandemic that had a devastating effect on British society, on public services, the NHS. We're talking one of the key priorities, on the economy as well. And I think the root of the current rot that we see in the Conservative Party really does kind of date from Partygate, and this kind of increasing sense that the Conservatives are in it for themselves, that they got on and did what they wanted to do whilst other people suffered. And I come from a family who is not into politics at all. I'm an anomaly. But it is one of those kind of those key things that sticks in their head. Well, we were all at home. We couldn't see you at Christmas, but they were having a lovely time. And then, of course, we see the defenestration of Boris Johnson and Truss, all of which are just kind of incrementally adding up to a party that is not acting in the interest of the country. It is just kind of having immense squabbles amongst itself. I'll give you a little kind of anecdote about, certainly, I think it's quite telling how things might kind of pan out in a couple of weeks. I have lived in the same constituency with various boundary changes for 9 years now, and my local MP has always been a cabinet minister, is still a cabinet minister, well, until the dissolution of Parliament. I have never seen him before on my doorstep. I have seen him twice in the last 3 weeks. So I think that is very, very telling. But yes, the Conservative Party have eaten themselves.
Absolutely, they've taken a wrecking ball to themselves for one reason or another. Boris Johnson, I think there was always, should we say, a risk to his leadership, and it probably came to pass in terms of in terms of known questions around the man's personal integrity and a tendency towards verbal inexactitudes, as Churchill might have put it. The Partygate affair really did shine a spotlight on the way that Downing Street worked, on him personally, his repeated lies. I mean, if we're thinking about sort of valence politics, I mean, the competence and in integrity, well, the integrity aspect, the honesty part of it was blown away. Competence, well, I suppose even here, yeah, got Brexit done. Johnson made a great play about levelling up, but that was pretty much, where did that go to? What did it achieve? Virtually nothing. I don't think anyone's really experienced any kind of levelling up. So he imploded. The Tories started fighting amongst themselves, and then you had Liz Truss. And if you ever, I'm not sure how long this will last, but if you ever want to make a group of students in a room laugh, just say Liz Truss, and it's guaranteed to bring smiles to their faces. This was a prime minister who lasted 49 days in office, not as long as the lettuce. The much much praised lettuce that outlasted her. I think the Daily Mirror? I should know that.
Star, I think.
Was it the Daily Star? Okay, so that's right. The live feed on social media of the lettuce lasting longer than Liz Truss. No, the party has just sort of torn themselves apart. They've also torn themselves apart, not just necessarily sort of over more valence issues, but also just on positions issues. The right in the party has been banging its ideological drum more and more loudly. It was emboldened by Brexit. The moderates kept quiet largely, and insofar as they did speak out, weren't really given much of a platform. So the party itself just now appears, frankly, not particularly competent, self-serving, in it for themselves, ideologically extreme. Whatever, I mean, it's kind of got the Midas touch in the literal sense. Whatever it touches, goes wrong or tends to go and becomes unusable. And you can see that really in the campaign. Yeah, and I suppose the counter side, of course, why things went wrong. You do need to look at the opposition. It isn't the case that what's the old saying? Oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. But of course, governments only lose elections when there is an opposition that people are willing to vote for. And whilst the Conservatives have been busy imploding, fighting themselves, Labour's been having its fair share of struggles and internal strife too. Starmer has been criticised by some in the party for excluding those on the more ideologically left of the party, and his attempt to take the party away from its Jeremy Corbyn era, which was, I suppose, very Marmite. Some people loved Jeremy Corbyn, many people did not. And Starmer has, admittedly very cautiously, not always with enormous charisma, has at least made the Labour Party a plausible party of government again. And I think that's sort of the other crucial flip side to the question of why things have gone so wrong for the Conservatives. They've imploded, whilst Labour has also, to a large extent, or certainly a greater extent than previously, got its act together.
And just to kind of, come in on that as well, that I guess there's a kind of a sense of feeling that the Conservatives have had lots of chances. They're on their third prime minister since the 2019 election. So there have been changes of faces, there have been changes of ideas, which I don't think has helped, but also there have been big changes in policy. And it was quite bizarre when you had Sunak rowing back on the net zero policies that he did at the tail end of last year. The way he was speaking, it was almost like these have been introduced by the Labour Party and how terrible they were, and we need to get rid of them immediately. But they've been introduced by Boris Johnson. So there's a kind of a sense of contradiction, I think, in the Conservative Party. HS2, this kind of much vaunted railway extension that has been cancelled after however many years and millions and billions of pounds of costs. Okay, it originated in the last Labour government, if I remember correctly, but it was it was really being sold as this kind of fantastic way of leveling up the country by Johnson, and then it gets scrapped. It gets curtailed, and it's just this kind of sense of, well, why would you trust the Conservatives? Because they'll just change the prime minister anyway, and they'll just row back on any policy they're promising anyway.
So we're now approaching the end of the podcast, but I didn't want to let you go without asking what might happen after the 4th of July. So I just wanted you to talk about the main challenges the election winner will face, also taking into account that, many independent analysts, as you will know, are saying that the main parties are not being completely honest about the scale of the challenges that the country is facing.
I mean, I think the interesting thing, for trying to sort of take a slightly long-term perspective, I suspect the team around Starmer, and this is a point that Alia alluded to, so the idea of alternating predominance in UK party politics. So since 1979, we've had sort of very slow and extended swings of the political pendulum. So 18 years of Conservative government, 13 years of Labour government, 14 years of Conservative, a bit of Lib Dem government. So Team Starmer is, I'm sure, very conscious that they want, as Blair did, they want to win the next election as well. So I think the biggest political challenge, in a sense, is going to be the 2029 or 2028 general election, and what Labour can do to ensure that they're best placed to win that. Now, it may well be the case that the Conservatives, as happened after 1997, are so discredited that they're not going to be a serious threat and rival anyway. But Labour can't bank on that. So I suppose Labour has to try to maintain its support base for as long as possible. That means addressing some of the very obvious challenges currently facing British politics, facing British society, particularly around public services, people's experiences of the state, what the state does for them, and of course the economy, the state of the economy, which is essential for their own private wealth, but also, of course, that is so essential for actually funding and financing the public services. So Labour's not got a lot to play with. Its margins and room for move are very, very tight. It's going to try to grow the economy through a little bit more intervention. It's obviously Labour rode back on its own environmental commitments and the enormous package of spending that it was going to introduce to improve the green infrastructure of the UK. But it's going to work on that to a lesser extent anyway. And I suppose it's really got to try to push economic growth and draw on that to some extent to help fund the promises it's made on improving the public services. At the same time, it's trying to get some additional tax revenue through closing tax avoidance loopholes and so on to sort of increase revenue there. But it still hasn't got a huge amount of room to play with. And of course, I suppose that the key thing to bear in mind is if the party is going to be thinking about the next election because it wants to be in office for a long time in order to actually do something, it takes several years to actually achieve anything. It will want to make sure that there's enough improvement in 4 years, 5 years time to try to so it can benefit from it. I guess sort of that's so. How might it do that? Well, one thing is just going to have to be sort of expectations management. Now that carries its own risk. It could sort of deflate support. It could have the effect of failing to mobilize its support base even after the election. But I think really the long game is going to be Labour's biggest challenge in trying to ensure that when the next election that comes along, things are as going well enough as possible for the party to be able to make a convincing case to put to the voters to be re-elected. So I mean that's sort of trying to look really long term, I think.
I think, one of the key challenges that's going to occur after the election is also how parties manage themselves. We've kind of already alluded to the potential prospects of the Conservative Party. Do they continue to exist as a political party? If they do we see a splintering of the kind of the more moderate centre right versus the more right wing of the party? Do they kind of collaborate with Reform? Nigel Farage is talking about potentially being in a position to run for Prime Minister in 2029. So there'll be a lot of kind of party turmoil and dark nights of the soul for the Conservative Party between now and then. But equally, Labour have got a challenge. Okay, the landslide victory is probable. No votes have been cast, as politicians keep saying every time I watch a news interview. But this probable landslide majority inherently means that you will capture constituencies that aren't your natural home. and are populated by not your natural voters. And often you will end up with MPs who aren't your normal MPs. It's part of the challenge that we see after the 2019 election for the Conservatives. All of a sudden, you've got red wall MPs who are kind of going against what the party says. I find it fascinating also what's going to happen with the SNP in Scotland and how they have really gone from being this kind of really dominant political force to, I think they're forecast to lose about 14 seats in a kind of fairly conservative estimates at present. And one of the narratives certainly under Sturgeon latterly was that a majority of seats that would be a kind of an endorsement for independence. We can move for another independence referendum. How can you justify potentially another independence referendum if you don't have a majority of the seats? Brian Cox was speaking yesterday, the actor Brian Cox, about whether the SNP were actually moving away from independence, and that would be a massive thing for the Scottish National Party. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm excited.
All right, our time is up. Thank you both so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it too. I'm sure they have, and I also hope that it's helped them to better understand what's going on at the moment in this part of the world. Thank you so much again.